They laughed at me, my own blood. At a family meeting meant for important decisions, they scoffed at my clothes, my quiet presence, and worst of all, called me poor. My daughter-in-law smirked as if I were a useless antique. What they didn't know was that while I lived modestly, I owned every building on the block they envied. They didn't see the nights I worked 3 jobs while they vacationed on my dime. They never asked why I kept receipts. But in that moment, something in me broke. I'm not poor. I'm patient. And patience makes empires. My name is Margaret Ellis, and I live in Oregon. And today I'll teach them the cost of disrespect. I never wanted much. A warm home, a seat at the table, the sound of my grandson's laughter filling the hallway that was enough for me, or at least I thought it was. Until that day, we were all gathered in my son Michael's newly renovated living room. The floors were polished so bright, you could see your own shame in them. My daughter-in-law, Vanessa, had arranged a family financial meeting, as she called it, complete with spreadsheets, projections, and her favorite red lipstick that always seemed to sneer even when she smiled. Everyone was there. Michael, Vanessa, their 2 children glued to their iPads, and Vanessa's parents sipping wine like they were royalty in a crumbling kingdom, and me sitting quietly on the armrest of a chair no one offered me. The meeting began politely enough, talk of budgeting, retirement planning, the kids' college savings, but soon the polite masks slipped and the real conversation began. I just think we need to talk about the future realistically, Vanessa said, fingers tapping her tablet. With mom living in the house we're paying the mortgage on and her not contributing. I felt a sudden heat behind my eyes. Vanessa, Michael interrupted, but his voice was as weak as the apology that never came. He didn't defend me. Not really. He just shifted in his seat and looked at the floor like a child waiting for the teacher to scold someone else. Vanessa continued, emboldened. I mean, no offense, Margaret, but you don't work. You don't drive. You don't really bring anything to the table financially. You live like someone who doesn't get how expensive everything is now. Then came the words that splintered my heart. You're just poor. The room fell into an awkward silence, but the damage was done. I looked around expecting anyone to say something, to stand up, to object. But no one did. Not Michael, not the children, not even Vanessa's parents, who just looked at me with thin-lipped pity as though I were a stray cat they tolerated at their doorstep. Poor. I felt the word settle on me like dust, like soot, like a branding iron I hadn't asked for. They had no idea. No idea what I'd sacrificed. No idea what I'd endured. No idea how many nights I'd gone to sleep hungry in the early years, just so Michael could eat another helping. No idea that the old creaky house they mocked was paid off decades ago by me. No idea that while they were financing their Range Rover, I was collecting rent checks from 6 tenants downtown. I'd never told them, not because I was hiding, but because I believed love wasn't something you earned through power plays or financial leverage. I believed in humility, in dignity, in keeping one's head down and giving from the heart. And now here I was, 70 years old, being told by my own son's wife that I brought nothing to the table. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that once packed Michael's lunches, wiped his tears, sewed his Halloween costumes when money was too tight for store-bought ones. I looked around the room and realized I wasn't family to them anymore. I was an inconvenience, a burden, a bill they wanted to erase. But something shifted in me that day. A voice inside me, long buried beneath years of swallowing disrespect, finally rose. No more. No more apologizing for existing. No more shrinking so others could feel tall. No more being the easy target for people who'd forgotten everything I'd done for them. They think I'm poor. Let them. Because the truth would break them. I stood up slowly, careful not to let them see the way my hands were trembling, not from weakness, but from restraint. I smiled just enough to be polite and said, well, I suppose that's all the clarity I needed today. Vanessa blinked. Wait, what does that mean? But I was already picking up my purse. I walked past Michael, who opened his mouth as if to say something but said nothing at all. As I reached the door, I turned. For the record, I said calmly, there's more than one way to own a house. And with that, I walked out. Not just out of their living room, but out of the identity they had shackled me to for far too long. What they didn't know, what they would soon learn, is that their so-called poor old mom held more power than all of them combined. Because while they were mocking me in designer shoes they could barely afford, I was quietly holding the deed to the land beneath their dreams. People see an old woman in secondhand clothes and think they know everything. They think they can sum up a life in one word: poor. But they never saw the nights I came home with my uniform soaked in sweat, or the way I'd massage my own swollen feet in the dark so I wouldn't wake anyone. They never saw the things I gave up my dreams, my peace, my health, just to hold a family together. When Michael was born, I was 24 and already used to doing without. His father, Leonard, was the kind of man who knew how to disappear when it mattered most. He came and went, but I stayed. I worked full shifts as a waitress at the diner, then cleaned offices at night. When Michael got chickenpox, I was fired for missing too many days in a row. I still remember the ache in my chest when I had to pawn my wedding ring for rent. I cried all the way home, then dried my face and read him bedtime stories like everything was fine. And I never told him, because that's what mothers do. When he was 10, we moved in with my sister briefly after I fell behind on bills. I remember folding their laundry just to earn our keep hearing whispers through thin walls about how pitiful I'd become. I swallowed it all. Dignity was a luxury I couldn't afford back then. But I always found a way. I took accounting classes at night, learned to budget every cent, and by the time Michael graduated high school, I had saved enough for a modest down payment on a small duplex. It was the first property I ever owned. I rented out one unit and we lived in the other. I didn't buy new clothes. I didn't take vacations. I reinvested every penny. When he went to college, I sold the duplex at a profit and used that money to help pay his tuition. He never asked where the money came from. He just said thank you and went on with his life. When he married Vanessa, I handed them an envelope with a check that represented 10 years of skipped haircuts, missed meals, and mended shoes. I didn't attend their honeymoon. I worked a temp job instead, so their gift wouldn't bounce. Again, I never told him. Because love, I thought, didn't need to be announced with a trumpet. It was stitched quietly into the fabric of every sacrifice. But over time, something changed. The phone calls grew fewer, the visits shorter. I became the babysitter, the emergency backup plan, the one they remembered when they needed someone to watch the kids or lend a few $100s just until payday. And I kept saying yes, because I remembered the boy with skinned knees and big dreams, not the man who now looked through me like I was just part of the wallpaper. I moved in with them 3 years ago, after a bad fall left me unable to climb stairs. Vanessa said they had room, but made sure I felt like a guest in a home I helped furnish. I offered to contribute. I tried to cook clean, stay out of their way. But no matter what I did, I could feel the tension. Like I was a permanent reminder of something they resented. Like I was holding them back. And still, I said nothing. I smiled through gritted teeth when Vanessa complained about grocery prices. I ignored the way she rolled her eyes when I handed her coupons. I stayed silent when she bragged about their investments, not knowing I quietly owned 2 buildings less than 4 blocks from their house, rented to businesses that paid me more monthly than they earned combined. I suppose I told myself I was being noble, humble. I didn't want to boast. I didn't want to shame them. But the truth was, part of me still hoped they'd remember who I was, what I'd done. They never did. And when they called me poor, it wasn't just an insult. It was an erasure of every late shift, every sleepless night, every missed meal, every birthday I worked through just so they could have cake and candles. They erased me, and I let them. But that night, as I sat alone in my little room, my corner, as Vanessa liked to call it, I opened the drawer at the bottom of my suitcase and pulled out the old file folder I hadn't touched in years. Deeds, contracts, titles, all signed in my name, all quietly accumulated during a lifetime of being underestimated. 4 commercial buildings, 2 duplexes, 1 strip mall, and 5 acres of undeveloped land I bought 15 years ago because I overheard a banker say the light rail was expanding. I stared at those papers, those ink-stamped testaments to the woman no one saw. And for the first time in a long time, I saw her too. Not just a tired mother, not a forgotten grandmother, but a strategist, a fighter, a woman who survived everything life threw at her and built something real from the scraps. And maybe it was time they saw her too. You might wonder why I never told them, why I kept the contracts locked away, why I wore the same old sweater winter after winter, why I let them think I had nothing, why I sat at their table quietly while they threw crumbs of respect in my direction, if even that. The answer isn't pride, and it isn't shame either. It's love, stubborn, aching, blind love. The kind that whispers, let them have the spotlight. You've done your part. But looking back now, I can see what I refused to face, that my silence became permission, that my sacrifice turned invisible, that every time I chose humility, they heard worthless. And yet the real reason I stayed silent was him, my husband Leonard. He wasn't a good man, not really, but he wasn't a monster either. He was lost. He drank too much, laughed too little, and held his disappointments like medals he'd never earned. For years, I believed that if I just worked harder, stayed quieter, forgave faster, he'd come around. That one day he'd stop looking through me and finally see the woman who stood beside him in the fire. But he never did. He died with bitterness in his lungs and a savings account in the red. No insurance, no apology, no goodbye. Just a final silence that stretched across the hospital room like fog. After he passed, something in me shifted. I stood at the cemetery wearing a borrowed coat and felt strangely free. And in that freedom, I made a promise to myself I will never depend on anyone again. That night, I opened a new bank account. I called a friend who was in real estate. I took the small severance check from the diner I'd worked at for 14 years and bought into a tiny property on the edge of town. A gamble, really. But I was tired of being at the mercy of others. The risk paid off. The following years weren't easy, but I kept my promise. I reinvested every dime. I read books on property management, asked questions no one expected a woman like me to ask. I walked into city council meetings with my notes neatly organized in my purse and made deals over kitchen counters, not boardrooms. One day I realized I wasn't surviving anymore, I was building, quietly, brick by brick. But I still said nothing. Michael was growing up then, going through college, falling in love with Vanessa. I didn't want to distract him. I wanted him to succeed on his own merit. I wanted him to believe that everything he earned came from his own strength, not from a mother who'd clawed her way out of the dark. So I kept my properties out of conversations. I never mentioned the rent checks. I never flaunted the slow accumulation of wealth that over 2 decades made me one of the largest private landowners in our neighborhood. Even when Michael and Vanessa started struggling, fighting about money living paycheck to paycheck, I didn't say a word. I helped when I could, quietly covered tuition gaps for the kids, paid their property taxes when they forgot, slipped cash into Michael's coat pocket when he visited after a layoff. Because that's what mothers do, right? They help, without applause, without expectation. But somewhere along the way, they stopped seeing it, stopped seeing me. When I moved into their home, I brought only 2 suitcases. Vanessa scoffed when I said I'd pay rent. Just help with the kids, she said, as though I were a live-in maid. I didn't complain. I didn't argue. I thought maybe this is what family means now, different, but still love. But love doesn't look like that meeting. Love doesn't call you poor when you've bled for everyone else's comfort. That night, as I sat rereading the contracts, the deeds I'd hidden for so long, I asked myself why I really stayed silent. And the truth unraveled. It wasn't just about love, it was fear. Fear that if they knew what I had, they'd see me as a resource instead of a person. Fear that they'd ask for more than I could give. Fear that I'd lose what little respect I still clung to. Fear that they'd feel entitled to my sacrifices. And worse, fear that if I did reveal it all, they wouldn't care. Because it was never really about money, it was about worth, value, dignity, recognition. Things I hadn't had in years. But now that fear was gone. In its place, a steady rising calm. Not rage, not yet, but something stronger. Clarity. The clarity to know that silence hadn't protected me. It had erased me. So I pulled out a pen, opened a new notebook, and started to make a list. One by one, I wrote down every property, every tenant, every payment plan, and backup fund I had built from scratch. Then I circled the names of the ones in their neighborhood. The ones they parked next to, the ones they got their lattes from, the ones they walked past on their way to work. They had mocked the woman who owned the very ground beneath their feet, and I decided it was time they saw the full picture. But I wouldn't raise my voice. I wouldn't shout, scream, or beg. No, I'd do what I had always done quietly, strategically, and with unwavering grace. They thought I was just an old woman in their spare bedroom. They were about to meet Margaret Ellis, the woman who built an empire under their noses. The next morning, I woke before the sun rose. It was quiet, peaceful, the kind of silence that used to soothe me. But not anymore. Not after that meeting. Not after the word poor dug into my chest like a dull knife. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the old blue notebook where I'd written out every property I owned the night before. My hand hovered above it, trembling not with fear, but something deeper. A strange sort of power, the kind I hadn't felt in decades. For most of my life, I believed that dignity meant swallowing my pride. I believed in being small to keep peace. I believed it was more noble to serve than to shine. But that belief, it died in that living room somewhere between Vanessa's smirk and Michael's silence. I stared at the list again. 8 properties, 6 active tenants, 1 commercial lease being renegotiated for double the rate. The duplex that I used to live in was now generating over $3,000 a month in rent alone. I had enough passive income to live wherever I wanted, comfortably, quietly, on my own terms. Yet I was sitting in their guest room watching them pity me like I was their charity case. It was laughable. No, actually, it was insulting. I got up and walked to the full length mirror on the back of the door. I hadn't really seen myself in a while. The woman staring back wasn't frail. She was tired, yes, but there was something else behind her eyes now. A quiet storm. And storms don't ask permission. I took a long shower. I opened the drawers and pulled out the one outfit I had packed away and kept hidden a navy blue pantsuit I hadn't worn in years. Crisp, tailored, powerful. I put it on like armor. Downstairs, Vanessa was in the kitchen sipping her matcha smoothie. She glanced at me and blinked. "You're dressed up?" she said, her voice full of confusion. "Going somewhere." I smiled. "Yes, just a few errands." She raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Of course she didn't, because in her eyes I was harmless, forgettable, just a background presence in her curated, filtered life. Perfect. I stepped outside and took a deep breath. The air smelled different when you finally decided to live for yourself. First stop, the bank. I met with my investment advisor, a kind woman named Teresa, who'd handled my assets for the past 10 years. She blinked when I walked in. "Margaret, we haven't seen you in a while. Everything all right?" Everything, I replied, is about to get very all right. We reviewed my portfolios. I had enough in liquid assets and property equity to buy another home outright. But I didn't want just a house. I wanted a symbol, a declaration. So I asked her to find me something. A small coastal cottage. Quiet, secluded, with a porch that faced the ocean. I wanted a place that had nothing to do with them, nothing to do with my past, a place that belonged only to me. After the bank, I visited my attorney, a quiet man with kind eyes who helped me set up the trusts years ago. He smiled when I walked in. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon." I slid the blue notebook across the desk. "It's time," I said. "I want everything reorganized, I want the assets protected, and I want to remove my son from any future claims." He paused. "Are you sure?" I met his gaze without blinking. "I'm done giving to people who only know how to take." He nodded and got to work. Next, I walked into one of my own buildings, a strip mall on the edge of town, small but thriving. I met with the property manager, reviewed some upcoming lease renewals, and reminded myself what I had built. Every brick, every tile, every business inside those walls was a testament to the woman they never bothered to see. By the time I returned home that evening, the house felt smaller, like it was shrinking to fit their narrow-mindedness. Vanessa greeted me at the door. "Everything okay?" "Never better," I said, setting down my purse. She didn't ask questions. She assumed, as always, that nothing had changed. But inside me, everything had. Later that night, Michael knocked on my door. He stood awkwardly holding his phone. "Hey, Mom, I just want to say, I know yesterday was kind of harsh. Vanessa's under a lot of pressure. She didn't mean it." I tilted my head. "But you did, didn't you?" He looked away. "That's not fair." "Oh, I agree," I said gently. "It's not fair to be insulted in the home I help pay taxes on. It's not fair to be called a burden when I raised you alone, Michael. When I gave up everything." His shoulders slumped. "I didn't know you felt that way." "You never asked." We stood there in silence. I think I said finally, "It's time I make some changes. For myself." He looked alarmed. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I said I won't be here much longer." And just like that, his face changed. A flicker of uncertainty, of fear, of guilt. He tried to hide it, but I saw. Good. Let him wonder. Let them both wonder. Because the doormat they walked on for years had gotten up and was about to show them how high she could rise. I planned it carefully, every word, every detail, every seat at that table. Not out of malice, but precision. You don't spend your life being dismissed and ignored without learning how to be deliberate. The invitation went out from me personally. I told them I wanted to thank the family for all they'd done for me over the years. Vanessa lit up at the idea of being the center of attention again. Michael seemed surprised, but said he'd invite his in-laws. I said, of course. I had it catered. A modest spread, nothing too extravagant. I knew better than to show my hand too soon. I wore that same navy blue pantsuit, sharp, intentional. I wasn't there to blend in anymore. The guests trickled in like always. Vanessa's parents brought wine. Her sister brought her baby and let it scream without apology. Michael set the table, carefully placing me at the far end again, assuming I'd be a quiet observer. But I had other plans. At exactly 7 p.m., I tapped my spoon to my water glass. The chatter stopped. Eyes turned toward me. For the first time in years, the room actually listened when I spoke. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "I know it's not often that I ask for your attention. Tonight will be different. Vanessa smiled indulgently. Michael looked vaguely uncomfortable. The children scrolled through their phones under the table. I reached into my handbag and pulled out a sleek leather folder. Slowly, I opened it and laid out several documents before me, neatly arranged, labeled, and color-coded. "What's that?" Vanessa asked, her voice tight. "Deeds," I replied. "Property titles, trust documentation, asset evaluations." Silence. "I wanted to clear something up," I said softly. "There was a word used last week, one that stuck with me." I looked directly at her. Poor. The air turned brittle. You could hear forks being set down, a cough from across the table. "I've been called many things in my life," I continued. "Quiet, modest, old-fashioned. But poor, that was a new one. And while I don't usually feel the need to defend myself, I realized I've done myself and this family a disservice." I stood. "For too long, I allowed you all to see only what I let you see. The old woman in borrowed clothes, the tired mother, the babysitter, the burden." Vanessa's face had gone pale. Michael stared at the folder like it was a ticking bomb. "I own," I said clearly, 8 properties in this county, 3 commercial, 5 residential. The rent I collect monthly exceeds your combined household income. I have a 7-figure investment portfolio, and the house you live in, the one you think you're paying off." I paused. Let the silence throb. "I've been covering the mortgage for over a year." Gasps, a choked laugh from Vanessa's sister. Vanessa's wine glass shook in her hand. Michael blinked rapidly. "Mom, why didn't you tell us?" "Because I wanted you to love me for me, not for what I could give, and because I didn't think it mattered until you made it matter." I turned to Vanessa. "You called me poor in front of your children. You mocked my clothes, my quietness, my presence. But here's what you didn't know, dear. You've been sipping lattes on sidewalks I own." She opened her mouth to speak, but I raised my hand. "I'm not finished." I opened another folder, this one thinner. Inside was a formal letter notarized and stamped. "I've contacted a real estate agent. I'm selling one of the duplexes and using the profit to purchase a coastal property. I'll be moving out by the end of next month." Michael sat up straight. "Wait, you don't have to do that." "I do," I said calmly. "Because I deserve peace. And because I don't need to sleep under a roof where I'm pitied." I looked around the table, each face stunned into silence. For years, I gave everything I had. My energy, my money, my time. I loved this family with every corner of my heart. But love, I said, voice-catching, shouldn't cost you your dignity. I picked up the leather folder and clutched it to my chest. "I'm not here to be cruel. I'm here to end the illusion. I've never been poor. I've simply been patient." Michael's jaw worked like he wanted to say something, anything, but found no words. Vanessa was blinking rapidly, her hands trembling in her lap. Finally, she whispered, "Why now?" I met her eyes, steady and calm. "Because I refuse to spend another year pretending to be less than I am so others can feel more." I sat down. For the first time in years, I felt taller than the room. The family ate in near silence. Some avoided eye contact. Others stared at their plates. No one dared speak over me again. When dessert came, Michael reached over and took my hand. "Mom, I'm sorry." I gave a soft smile. "I know." But what I didn't say, and what he would learn in time, was that forgiveness and return were 2 separate roads. And I had already chosen mine. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. No footsteps rushing past my door, no blender screeching in the kitchen, no loud phone calls on speaker from Vanessa pacing down the hall. Just silence. And then a soft knock. It was Michael. His eyes were red. He looked like he hadn't slept. "Can we talk?" he asked, almost like a child. I nodded and stepped aside. He sat on the edge of the bed, like he used to when he was little and had done something wrong. I didn't know, he said barely above a whisper. "I didn't know about any of it." "I never told you," I replied, but not knowing and not seeing, those are 2 different things. He dropped his head into his hands. "I feel like a complete idiot, no, a failure, as a son, as a man." I didn't say anything. Let the silence stretch, because sometimes silence is louder than anger. He looked up again. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me you were comfortable?" I smiled faintly. "Because I wanted you to be proud of your own life. I wanted you to build something on your own, not off the back of my sacrifice." "I didn't build anything," he said bitterly. "Vanessa runs everything, and now I see how ugly it's gotten." He sighed. "She's not a bad person, she's just—" I raised my hand gently. "You don't have to defend her. I'm not angry. But you should be." I tilted my head. I was. But anger is a short fire. I'm not interested in burning. I'm interested in walking away whole. He rubbed his face and nodded slowly. "Do you hate me?" That question, that small, fragile question coming from the man I carried in my body, protected with my life fed when I had nothing left to feed myself. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. No, I said softly, but I no longer see you the same. His lips quivered. I failed you. No, I said you forgot me, and that's worse. He began to cry, shoulders, shaking hands, trembling. It wasn't performative, it was raw, cracked, and real. I wanted to reach out, to stroke his hair like I did when he was little, to wipe his tears and tell him everything would be okay. But I didn't, because some things aren't meant to be patched. Some things need to be left broken so the lesson lives in the cracks. Later that afternoon, Vanessa came to me. Gone was her usual armor, no lipstick, no condescending smirk. Just a woman humbled and haunted. I owe you the biggest apology, she said, her voice brittle. I looked at her, really looked, and for the first time I saw fear in her eyes. Not fear of me, but fear of loss. Margaret, she continued, I was wrong. I was blind, selfish. I treated you like a chore, not a person. I don't know how to undo it. You can't, I said plainly. You can only learn from it. Tears welled in her eyes. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need to say this, I'm sorry. Deeply, truly. You were never poor. I was just too shallow to see your worth. Her voice cracked. Please don't leave. And for a brief second, I saw the girl she used to be. Young, insecure, trying too hard to belong. I didn't feel anger anymore, just distance. You're forgiven, I said. Her eyes widened. But I continued, forgiveness doesn't mean restoration. It just means I no longer carry the weight of your words. That weight is yours now. She nodded, crying openly. I understand. I believed she did. But I also knew the change had come too late for me. That evening, I packed a small suitcase, just a few dresses, my notebooks, and the leather folder holding every deed, every paper trail of my journey from invisible to independent. Michael helped carry it to the car. I could help you find a mover, he offered. I already hired one, I replied. He stood there, hands in his pockets, looking lost. Like the ground beneath him was suddenly unfamiliar. I hope someday you'll come visit, he said. I gave a soft smile. Maybe, but I think I need time, and space, and a view of the ocean. He chuckled sadly. You always did like the water. I like the way it moves forward, I said, without asking permission. As I closed the car door, Vanessa stepped out onto the porch with the children. They waved hesitantly. I waved back. Not in bitterness, not in goodbye, but in peace. As we pulled away, I didn't look back. I had no need to. Because I wasn't running away, I was stepping into something new. And some regrets are meant to be felt, not for punishment, but for transformation. And I prayed with all the quiet love left in my heart that this regret would be their mirror, and that they'd finally see not just me, but themselves. The cottage was exactly as I imagined. Perched on a quiet stretch of the Oregon coast, it had weathered shingles, wind-chimed windows, and a wraparound porch that faced the endless sea. No fences, no neighbors peeking through curtains, just the sound of waves speaking to the shoreline and the sky shifting through shades of grace. When I walked through the front door for the first time, I didn't cry. I thought I would. I expected a flood of emotion, a cinematic moment of falling to my knees in gratitude. But instead, I felt something quieter, stronger. I felt home. For the first time in years, I belonged entirely to myself. No borrowed corners, no whispered resentment, no need to make myself small. Just me, the sea, and the life I'd quietly built brick by brick while everyone else looked away. I spent the first few days unpacking slowly. I touched every object with intention. The teacup I'd hidden in a cabinet at Michael's house now sat proudly on my windowsill. The knitted throw I'd once used to warm a grandchild who didn't know my name now covered my own bed. Every item, every room an offering to the woman I had finally remembered I was. The phone call started the second day. Michael called first. I didn't answer. Then a text. Mom, please let me know you're okay. The kids miss you. I miss you. I read it twice. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but I typed nothing. Because this wasn't about punishment. It was about pause. Vanessa called on day 3. She left a voicemail, tearful, genuine, saying she was starting therapy and hoped I'd give her a second chance. I listened and then deleted it. Not out of cruelty, out of peace. I needed stillness, not another round of apologies. I had heard them. I had believed them. But I had also outgrown the need to babysit someone else's growth. Forgiveness doesn't require presence. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself and for them is to let go completely. By the end of the week, the fog lifted, and the morning sun stretched across my porch like an invitation. I took my tea outside, wrapped in the silence I used to dread, and now I savored it like honey on the tongue. A few neighbors passed by and waved politely. I waved back. No one asked my history. No one assumed anything about me. Here I was, just Margaret, not someone's mother, not someone's burden, not the afterthought in a family's group text. I was simply me, a woman who once scrubbed floors to feed a child, a woman who quietly built an empire while being called invisible, a woman who forgave but refused to return to a life of being needed only when convenient. On the 8th day, I opened my notebook, the same one I used to list my properties. But now I began a new list. Things I wanted just for me. It started small. Learn to paint again. Cook a meal that's just for pleasure. Read in the middle of the afternoon. Say no without guilt. Host a tea party with no one who shares my last name. It was the kind of list you make when you finally remember you are not just a role. You are a person. Midway through, writing a letter arrived. A thick envelope, Michael's handwriting. I considered tossing it aside, but curiosity won. Inside was a handwritten note front and back. Apologies, yes, but also reflections. He told me he remembered the time I walked in the snow just to bring him a new set of colored pencils for school. How I stayed up with him all night before his college entrance exam. How, looking back now, he saw every thread I wove into the fabric of his life. At the end, he wrote, I don't know if I deserve your presence again, but I will never again take your absence for granted. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. It mattered. But it didn't change my path, because healing is not about going back. It's about going forward stronger, clearer, lighter. And I had chosen my direction. I spent that afternoon walking the beach barefoot. The waves lapped at my ankles like old friends. I watched a seagull fight the wind and win. I let the sun warm my shoulders without thinking of who might need me next. I am not angry anymore. Not ashamed. Not waiting. I am simply becoming. And if they come to visit one day, I may welcome them with boundaries, with truth, with the quiet dignity I no longer have to hide. But they will not find the woman who once begged for love in her own house. They will find a woman who forgave everyone and finally remembered to choose herself.